The events of the last 36 hours, particularly the issue that now dominates the media coverage in America, and our political debates here on the floor, caused me to come here today to the floor of the Senate to speak for a few minutes to my constituents back in the state of Florida, but anyone else who clearly should care about this issue across our country, for it's one that impacts our nation in ways that I don't think have been fully vetted or are clearly understood by enough people. The idea that the Russian Federation at the command of Vladimir Putin interfered in our election is something that most Americans are now familiar with. It has been a topic of ongoing conversation, discussion, debate, argument, and dispute pretty much since the fall of 2016 and to the present day. It has morphed into something that has become domestically more of a partisan issue. Hard to believe if you were able to get in a time machine and go back just 5 years and tell someone that Russian interference in our election would become a partisan issue or along the lines of which we see it play out now, few would believe you. And I will spend very little time today talking about the past and saying, this, you guys did this on the other side of the aisle before we did and vice versa, because it isn't constructive and means nothing to the future. But it wasn't long ago in a major presidential debate where the Republican nominee Mitt Romney pointed to Russia as the greatest geopolitical challenge of the United States, and he was roundly mocked, not just by President Obama, who was running for re-election and subsequently won, but by many in the press. And I don't say that for purposes of drawing "you guys were wrong back then" kind of argument. I say it solely for purposes of understanding how far we have come and where we are today. By the way, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that statement. I believe, by and large, that the greatest geopolitical challenge for the United States and the world in the 21st century will be whether China's rise is peaceful and productive or not. But when the story of the 21st century is written, there will be some chapters in that book about Vladimir Putin and Russia. And it is a topic that increasingly dominates our domestic debate today in ways that I think require more careful examination and understanding if we are to make from it good public policy and good decisions for the country. I think it begins from something that I talked about last week, and that is understanding the nature of this conflict. And it begins with the man, Vladimir Putin. I don't know the man, but I know enough about him and have certainly learned enough about him to make some pretty clear assessments that I believe in deeply. The first is that this is a man raised in Cold War Soviet Union, where people were trained to be suspicious about each other, and who then went on to a career in the intelligence agency of that country, the KGB. And the result is that he is, by nature and by all accounts, both a suspicious and a paranoid individual, as someone probably would be if they spent their whole life lying to other people. You begin to assume that everyone is a liar. This is a man who made his living by deceiving Westerners and manipulating them. He also grew up in a society where neighbors spied on each other and kids turned their parents in, and you never really knew who the other person you were talking to was. But if you were reported as someone who was against the government, your career, your ability to go to school, and the quality of life for your family would be deeply impacted. There's no way you grow up in a society like that, in an environment like that, and then later on go and work as a spy, and it's not somehow frame the way you operate or think for years to come. The other thing that's pretty clear, for reasons I don't fully understand because I don't know him, I don't know his family, I don't know his upbringing, but he takes everything deeply personal. And so any sort of effort against Russia is not a geopolitical decision or something that he can depersonalize. He seems to absorb all these things as a personal attack on him. And as a result, I think he's come to view himself as Russia, as the embodiment of the Russian Federation. You add to all of that his views as a leader. And it's interesting because if you go back to Vladimir Putin just 15 years ago, he wasn't nearly as confident or as bold as he is at this moment. And there are a lot of reasons for it, but this is a person who accidentally became the leader of Russia. I mean, he's kind of almost a guy that stumbled into the role because of a series of circumstances. Hardly known before he had started his career as prime minister and went on to the presidency, but nonetheless someone who wound up in this position almost by accident. but since then has solidified his hold. And there is a Vladimir Putin from the first time around and the Vladimir Putin from the second time around. But one thing is abundantly clear from his public statements, and that is that he viewed the end of the Cold War as a disaster for Russia. And not for the reasons some people think, not an ideological rationale, but because Russia, which already has a deep and long history in its geopolitics of feeling ignored by Europe, ignored by Asia, and disrespected by the world, at the end of the Cold War, Russia was a nation that faced incredible challenges. Imagine for a moment if you are in the government or living in the Soviet Union and you oversee this incredible empire that covers all of this territory and all these nations within your sphere of influence, and overnight it all evaporates. And overnight, all of those countries in your periphery begin to join the other side. They start joining NATO, they start having elections, they start becoming allies of the United States, and your territory shrinks. So one day, Ukraine is part of the Soviet Union, the next day it's its own country. And then you add to that, over the last 12 to 15 years, the sort of emergence of the United States for much of that period of time as the world's sole superpower, while Russia was struggling to have an economy or even be relevant in the global discourse. And you come to see that Vladimir Putin viewed that period of time in world history up to the present day as an example of a strong America and a strong West abusing on a weak Russia. Because this is ultimately how he views life and how he views the world, as a battle between the weak and the strong, where the strong prey on the weak. And you know who he wants to be. So because of all of that, and because he's paranoid, and because he's suspicious, he believes the United States, for example, was behind the protests in 2011 that broke out in the streets against his rule. He believes the United States is behind everything that's happening in Ukraine. And all of this leads him to the two goals that he has. And there are two goals that have become crystal clear, especially beginning in his second term, or his second time around as president. A lot of people forget he was president, he left, and his hand-picked successor served for a period of time, and then he came back in the second time. And it is the second Putin that we're now dealing with. And since that time, two things have become pretty clear about his goals. The first is he wants to reestablish Russia once again as a world power, like in the time of the Soviet Union, on par with the United States of America. Now, he can't do that economically. A lot of people don't realize this, but Russia is the 9th or 10th largest economy in the world. To put it in perspective, the Italian economy, and Italy's a great country, the Italian economy, with less territory, less oil, less people, the Italian economy is bigger than the Russian economy. It's about equal to the Spanish economy. And I would dare say, for example, my home state of Florida has an economy now of about $1 trillion. Russia is at $2 trillion. There are states in this country who have an economy bigger than Russia, so he is not a global economic superpower. So the only thing that makes him a global superpower is the fact that they possess thousands of nuclear weapons and conventional military capabilities that are significant and have improved as he's invested in it. And he quickly realized that how I'm going to become relevant in the world again is not through my economic prowess or even through my diplomatic. The way I'm going to become relevant in the world again is I am going to use my conventional weapons or my conventional capabilities along some asymmetrical ones to inject myself in the discussion in different parts of the world and show people that Russia and Vladimir Putin are strong again. And that's what he's done. It actually began back in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia. We now commemorate the 10th anniversary of that. But it also plays out in his intervention in Syria, or the annexation of Crimea, and I believe would have been moving forward into Kiev and broader Ukraine had there not been the EU-US sanctions against them as a result. And so his first objective is to make Russia a world power again. The second objective that he thinks is tied to the first is he has to make America weaker, because Vladimir Putin is a strong believer in zero-sum propositions. Not in the idea that somehow we can both be better off or there can be a win-win, but a true believer in the idea that in order for you to be stronger, in order for me to be stronger or us to be stronger, you have to be weaker. And that plays out, in order for Russia to be stronger, America, who he views as his greatest geopolitical competitor, has to be weaker. And that's why they chose to interfere in the 2016 election. And the notion, first of all, let me just say this, I don't think Vladimir Putin interfered in our elections. I don't believe he interfered in our elections. I know it for a fact. And by the way, so does everyone who has looked at this issue and knows anything about it. There's zero doubt about it. What I think we're missing in our debate is the why and the how. The why is not what people think. He may have had a personal preference in an election. But his interference and his efforts to interfere in our elections began well before the President of the United States descended down those escalators in New York in the summer of 2015. They intended to do this long before that period of time. His number one objective was to ensure that no matter who was elected President of the United States, that person would assume office under a cloud of nagging and persistent controversy. He wanted to weaken them internally because as an intelligence officer, he understood the power of being weakened from within. He understood it so much that he protects his image in Russia. Jealously, he guards it, disclosing very little about himself or anything about his personal life, never putting himself in a position to appear vulnerable, only showing pictures of things that he wants people to see, and actually allowing no dissent, to the point where a substantial number of the people who have opposed Vladimir Putin are not out of politics, or not even in jail, they are dead. The world, sadly, the story of the world is littered with story after story of a Russian opposition figure found dead in his hotel room, strangled, fell out of a window, poisoned. Happens over and over again. These things are not a coincidence. But he wanted to weaken whoever the next president of the United States was. And no matter how this election turned out in November, whether the president was named Trump or Clinton, we would be dealing with a president right now under a cloud of controversy because he had it lined up either way. The second thing he wanted to do as part of the first part is undermine confidence in our institutions. And I mean all of our institutions, our elections, the media, our political figures, everything. And it's extended to important institutions, the FBI, our intelligence agencies, undermine confidence so that no one could be believed. So the president's under controversy, divide us against each other so that there is no authorities in which we trust. Some of this, by the way, was already happening in our country, but they had the nuanced understanding of it to be able to exploit it. And the third, as part of the first and the second, is to really drive divisions. Not just to weaken the president and undermine confidence in our institutions, but look for ways to do so by exacerbating pre-existing tensions in our society. These were the aims of the Russian interference campaign. Beyond everything else, it was not about electing one candidate over the other, it was about these things. And it would be hard to see what happened yesterday and the reaction to it and not conclude that this effort exceeded his wildest expectations. Today, the President of the United States has operated for the better part of a year and a half under a persistent cloud of controversy. On the one side, his political opponents intimating that his presidency is illegitimate, that his election was not real, that I heard words thrown around yesterday like treason. On the other side, a complete denial that there was any interference and the undermining publicly of important institutions in our country like the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which, by the way, is made up of thousands of employees, the vast and enormous majority of whom are patriotic Americans who keep us safe every single day. Undermining confidence in our institutions is tied to that point I just made. Not to mention the fact that increasingly Americans get their news and information from someone who tells you what you already believe. Confirm your bias. Just drove that even further. Driving, of course, our divisions. There is no way you could see what has happened in this country over the last year and a half, which was already happening, by the way, and for which all of us in American politics are somewhat responsible for, and not conclude that Vladimir Putin's plan to undermine the next presidency, no matter who it was, to undermine confidence in our institutions, and to drive divisions in our country has not been wildly successful at a very low price. Interesting, yesterday in one of the interviews that he did, I think it was Mr. Wallace at Fox News, asked him about this, and his response was, none of the things that were leaked were untrue, as if to almost say with a wink, even if we colluded, or even if we're not colluded, even if we hacked, and even if we did all these things and interfered, So what? We didn't lie. These were all true things. So what have I heard in response to some of this? I will not spend a lot of time addressing some of the arguments made by the president's opponents. There is an ongoing investigation conducted by Mr. Mueller, which I believe should reach its conclusion naturally as he continues to do his work. I have said this, and I'll repeat it. It is in the best interest of the President of the United States and of our country for Mr. Mueller to do his work without interference and be able to conclude it. No matter where you line up or who you voted for, we should all want to know the truth. That truth will ultimately have to be proven in a court of law. From his history, I have no reason to believe Mr. Mueller will not conduct a full, thorough, and fair investigation. And ultimately, it is truth and the light of the truth that will help us overcome a lot of these controversies that we find today. So any accusations until that has happened are unfair and unwise and counterproductive. But one of the arguments I've heard from people on my side of the aisle is that this is not a big deal because everybody does it. And if by everybody does it, you mean everybody spies, yes. Virtually every nation on earth has an intelligence agency, and some do a better job than others. But do not be misled. Everyone does not do what we saw in 2018. Our problem in 2018 is not that the Russians spy on the Americans, or that the Americans spy on the Russians, or that the Chinese spy on us. Our problem in 2018 is that the Russian Federation, under the command of Vladimir Putin, weaponized information. One thing is to gather information. Another thing is to strategically leak it in an effort to influence the domestic politics of another country. And that is what Vladimir Putin ordered done for purposes of undermining the next president, whoever it was, and undermining confidence in our elections and in our institutions. So they hack into emails, they release these emails through a third party, it's picked up in the media, it's reported, and then we fight about it. That's what they've done. They've done it in other countries for years. They did it somewhat in the Cold War, and they did it in 2016, and they will do it again. Let there be no doubt, they will do it again. And then after they've released all this stuff, they use their army of bots and trolls to drive this information online, on platforms, particularly trying to drive it to certain groups and people to divide us even further against each other. One of the most dangerous things they did, that's now open record in the indictment issued last week by the Mueller investigation, is they probed the electoral systems of our states and counties. And a lot of people are saying, well, they didn't get in the ballot box. Absolutely. I tell you now with full confidence that the reason why President Trump won has nothing to do with Vladimir Putin. Nothing. But I think we're wrong if we think that all we should be worried about is the ability to change votes at the ballot box. Because if they can somehow change people's registration, and enough people on election day go vote and are told you aren't allowed to vote, their trolls will be ready to drive that news out there on election day. And then, come election day, no matter who won, the other side will say, well, there was these weird things that happened down there in some county or in some state, and so the election's not valid. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine an election like 2000 in my home state decided by less than 600 votes. And imagine that in a Republican county, a bunch of Democrats went to vote on election day and were told, you can't vote today because you're not registered. If that happened to enough people, the Russian trolls would jump all over it. They would start driving it on the news. It would be featured on cable news that day. And that night, if they lost, they would be arguing the election was rigged. The electoral officials in the Republican county rigged the elections, all driven by the Russians, and vice versa, by the way. That is the danger, that we can one day potentially elect a president of the United States who swears into office with a substantial number of people believing that the election was stolen, undermining not just the president at that point, but our very system of democracy. That's what they did. And anyone who tells you that everyone does that is lying. Everyone does not do that. The United States does not do these things. I'm a big critic of the Chinese, but the Chinese don't do these things. I have other problems with them. The Belgians don't do this. The Japanese don't do this. Only one country in the world has weaponized information in this way to interfere in an election of an adversary. And that's the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin. Now, the other argument I've heard is, well, what's wrong with better relations with Russia? Nothing is wrong with better relations with Russia. I'll tell you right now, the world would be a better place, a more peaceful place. Our lives would be a little easier. We would be stronger if somehow we had a partner in the Russian Federation that we could work with to deal with things like terrorism and proliferation of nuclear weapons and Iran and all sorts of issues, North Korea. We all wish we had that. But the reason why that isn't happening, frankly, is not us. It's Vladimir Putin. Because for Vladimir Putin, better relations is not what he's interested in. He is not seeking a partnership with the United States. What he is seeking is geopolitical perceptional equality. He wants to be viewed on par with America, both himself as a leader and the country as a whole, and he believes the only way he can do that is to pull himself up and tear us down. And I'm frankly got to tell you, it's very difficult to have better relations with someone who believes that the only way they can be better off is for you to be worse off. And as long as the Russian Federation is led by someone who has total control of their government and has these views, it's going to be very difficult to have better relations. That does not mean that we don't meet with Vladimir Putin. Anyone who says that the meeting alone is wrong is not being wise and frankly disingenuous. 90% of the nuclear weapons on this planet are possessed by the United States and the Russian Federation. And that alone is reason for us to engage with Vladimir Putin. We have to. We have no choice. But we should engage with him with clear eyes and a clear understanding of what he's up to and what he's trying to do. And we should engage with a very clear understanding that this is a man that throughout his life as the leader of the Russian Federation has never passed up an opportunity to exploit the weakness of an adversary or a competitor. Every time he sees weakness and the opportunity to gain advantage, he will take it. And any engagement with him that doesn't understand that is a dangerous one. So I have no problem with having better relations with Russia. And frankly, I'm not one of these people that is over the top on Russia to the extent of the threat they pose. They have nuclear weapons. But we have bigger threats than Russia, but they are a very significant one that need to be addressed. And so, moving forward is what I hope we'll focus on. Mueller will continue his work. The Intelligence Committee that I sit on will continue its work. But we are going to have an election in a few months, and we're going to continue to have elections every 2 years, hopefully forever. And there is no reason to believe that they will not try to do this again. And that is why, earlier this year, along with Senator Van Hollen, I proposed the Deter Act, which is the only thing that Vladimir Putin understands deterrence. And what the Deter Act does is it says, here is a list of sanctions, and these sanctions will go into effect immediately if the Director of National Intelligence, after an intelligence assessment, determines that Russia is once again interfering in our elections. So that before he even does it, he has a very clear understanding of what the price is going to be. Men like Vladimir Putin operate as cost-benefit analyzers. They weigh the costs against the benefits, and then they decide what action to take. And there's no doubt that in 2016, he saw that the costs of what he did were very low. He thought he could hide it. He thought by the time we figured out it'd be too late. And he thought that America would be in such disarray that it couldn't get its act together and actually impose any additional sanctions. But he saw the benefits as extraordinary. And so he took action. And he'll do it again if he doesn't think the costs are high enough. And so my hope is that over the next few days and in a short period of time, we will figure out a way, working together as Americans on this issue, to set aside all the stuff about yesterday. That probe will continue. Our work on the Intelligence Committee will continue. And focus on the future. No matter how you feel about 2016, who among us would say that if Russia interferes in 2018, or any year from that matter, they shouldn't be punished? And who among us would say that if we have the opportunity to put into law strong consequences for interference that could deter such an attack, we wouldn't want to do it? And so that's why I hope that no matter how you may feel about the other things that are going on, the Senate can come together and work together to pass this law. Because otherwise, we are leaving our nation vulnerable. And I'll close with something I said back in October of 2016. And that is, Vladimir Putin is not a Republican, and he's not a Democrat, he's not a conservative, and he's not a liberal. Do not ascribe to him any of the attributes of American politics. He interfered in 2016 in order to create chaos and controversy, not to elect any particular party or individual. That was by far his strongest motivator. And he'll do it again. And I believe if left unchecked, he'll target members of the Senate who he thinks are his opponents. He'll target members of Congress. Eventually, he'll even target our debates outside of elections. I believe if left unchecked, they're going to take the next step and not just leak information, they're going to make it up. They're going to come up with 9 emails that are real and embed a 10th that is fake. And it's going to be reported. And it might cost someone their election, or it may cost someone enough heartache that they have to resign. Information is a very powerful weapon. You've already seen, if you go online, the ability to produce these deep fake videos that look real, that only an expert could tell are fake, of someone saying or doing something they never said or never did. Imagine that in the hands of a nation state, leaked 2 days before an election. They're going to do these things. It's going to happen if we do not deter it from happening, and if we do not prepare our nation and the American people. And if you think this is chaotic, then allow that to happen without informing us and preparing us and strengthening us and putting in place deterrence against that. Then you will know chaos, a chaos that will shake us to our core. And so I hope that we can take this small but important step of coming together as Americans and protecting our elections for years to come against an adversary that's determined to tear us down in order to build himself up. This is reality. This is the world and the threat we face. And the sooner we address it, the safer our nation and our people will be. I yield the floor.